guess, we'll get started if everyone is very punctual. Uh, so, welcome everyone. This is kind of our second go at a security stream for activists and protesters. This one is called Street Smart, a security mindset for activists. Last time we did more digital security, and we got a lot of questions about how to make decisions about all of this. It's like information overload and some more interpersonal thoughts about what you should do to stay safe. Um, so yeah, I'm going to read our description. Our current context of institutionalized anti-Black racism and state violence is calling us to think about keeping ourselves and the people we organize with safe. To make effective use of available tools and decide which are right for you and what trade-offs are worthwhile for your specific situation, it is useful to take time to assess your own needs around security. This panel hopes to provide an introduction to thinking about your own security context and needs by running through specific protest-related scenarios to model a process which you can practice to assess your own security needs. So that's kind of the thought process behind today. As far as the schedule goes, we're going to go from around 3 to 5 p.m. We'll have two speakers today. The first speaker is Gray from Cypurr Collective, and the second speaker is David Huerta from Freedom of the Press Foundation, who spoke last time as well. Both presenters are going to be going for about an hour, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end of each presenter for questions. So please try to hold your questions until those periods so that we can look and then answer you, so you don't get lost in the feed of comments. So I'll start off with introducing Gray. Security needs are personal, diverse, and valid, but may be complicated to navigate sometimes, especially in high-pressure situations. Gray will introduce the concept of threat modeling and will overview how a little bit of self-check and situational awareness can aid in the safety of yourself and your comrades. So thank you, and give it up for Gray whenever you want to start.
Cool. Let me just share my screen. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I can hear you. Cool. I separated the cats, so that shouldn't happen again. Okay, here we go. Okay. Folks can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yes, great. Cool. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for, coming out to this Twitch, Instagram live stream. Thank you for Babycastles for putting this on. My name is Gray. I'm from this group called the Cypurr Collective, which does pretty regular cybersecurity workshops and events around New York City. I'll talk about us more in a second. But basically today, what we're going to be talking about for the next hour is street smarts, or a lot like what the introduction was saying. Sometimes we are in very stressful situations, whether individually or in groups and contextually. And sometimes the hardest thing can be to understand what our own needs are, understand what threatens those needs, and to be able to act and react accordingly. Sometimes it may be overwhelming to make a decision in the moment, whether you're on the street or just at home, or certainly I've been there. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about threat modeling, which is kind of a concept used in a variety of venues, but this idea of kind of acknowledging and beginning to confront threats with the hope that you yourself or the group you're a part of becomes stronger for it. This is like the closest thing we have to like a self-help presentation, mostly because I feel like, the level of communication that can be developed through threat modeling by yourself or with a group, I think is just a healthy level of communication in general. So I think there are benefits even outside the 4 or 5 steps that we're going to present today. But a little bit about us. So we are the Cypurr Collective, right? A group of folks that organize cybersecurity events, looking to spread knowledge and talk about privacy rights. We came about a few years ago. Up until the quarantine, we've had pretty regular monthly events at the Brooklyn Public Library, Blue Stockings Bookstore. With Babycastles, we had a monthly social, which was a lot of fun. And a other events here and there. And just a little bit about myself. So my name is Gray. He, they pronouns are fine. And I myself am not in a cybersecurity or tech field. I'm just kind of like a, I don't know, hobbyist. Seems kind of underselling it a little bit, but at the very least, it's not my main job. It was something I picked up from joining the group, teaching these workshops over the past few years. Usually, I like to include the slide. Usually, this is in our in-person workshops. I don't know how Twitch is usually moderated. It's kind of new to me, or IG is usually moderated. But just some stuff, some of our kind of values that we like to keep in mind when we enter a room, because we want to make sure that the space in which we're presenting or which we're sharing space with others is as much of a safe space as possible, so people can focus more on the information and less on the aggressions or triggers that might distract them from this very, we think, useful knowledge. So a little bit of overview. It's a pretty straightforward presentation. If you've heard of threat modeling before, this might be kind of a repeat, but if you haven't heard of threat modeling before, haven't heard about it in this particular context, we're going to talk just basic definition. We're going to talk about it bare bones. And then the rest of the presentation is really going to be looking at different strategies of approaching threat modeling. Because there's, as you'll see, there's like 4 or 5 main questions that need to be answered when it comes to threat modeling or understanding your security. Understanding your security situation. But there's so many different ways that you can approach it. Some of these questions might, if you're asking themselves for the first time, might feel like abstract or overwhelming. Again, I use the word overwhelming a lot because I get overwhelmed a lot. And yeah, so we'll look at some strategies, some other tactics and techniques that we can use to approach these questions to get a better sense of our security models and what we need. And as we said, we saved a little bit of Q&A for the end or conversation. We always like to, we very rarely have workshops where I'm just like talking for an hour straight. In fact, I dislike it, so we'll see how this one goes. We like a good discussion back and forth, and we'll see what, I guess, Twitch or Instagram has to offer in that sense. But, so what's the problem? I'm going to start off by reading from the screen. Not the best presentation thing, but this is a pretty good definition. So threat modeling, a way of thinking about the sorts of protection you want for your data so you can decide which potential threats you are going to take seriously. It's impossible to protect against every kind of trick or adversary, so you should concentrate on which people might want your data, what they might want from it, and how they might get it. Coming up with a set of possible threats you plan to protect against is called threat modeling or assessing your risk. Pretty straightforward. You have something you want to protect, you feel like that thing is threatened, how are you going to go about addressing that? This is a quote that comes from the EFF Surveillance Self-Defense Guide, which is a great resource in general. They have a great article on threat modeling or security planning, and they have a bunch of other really cool tips and guides. So definitely check that out. We're going to share some resources at the end, and this is definitely going to be a part of it. So if you don't want to look it up now, I'll send it later. So, threat. Threat is a really big topic. What does it mean? What does threat mean? What does it mean to be threatened? We like to think that it's a very subjective thing. Like, even though we can all agree that we are all at times, we feel threat or are threatened, it comes out in very different ways. And it comes out in very different forms, whether physically or emotionally, mental health-wise, really, or just the way we kind of like frame our lives. So how can we start a conversation on threat modeling generally when it's such a big thing to ask for? Well, some things that help me kind of contextualize it a little bit. This prevention spectrum, this comes out of social sciences. This is the idea that there's actually kind of like 3 parts to any kind of threat event. There is the primary, the secondary, the tertiary, and of course the levels of it, the areas of intervention for each of them, primary, secondary, tertiary. Just to summarize, primary is kind of like before the event. So if we're taking, let's find an example. I'm so bad. I always should come up with examples, but I'm so bad at coming up with them on the spot. Oh, God. Okay, the first thing comes to mind. Let's say you have let's say you have a bunch of Oreo cakesters and you really want to eat them, but you feel like your roommate is going to disrespect the sticker policy in the fridge and is going to take them. So right now we're in the before stage. You got the Oreo cakesters, they're in the fridge. Nothing has quite happened yet, but you perceive that there is a threat coming. So primary prevention, primary, sorry, is the time period kind of before, where we kind of maybe future think a little bit, but also maybe prepare, accept that this might be something that happens, try to understand how bad of a thing it's going to be for us. Secondary prevention, immediately after something has occurred. So hypothetically, if your roommate comes home and goes to the fridge and takes the Oreo cakesters, and you see them eating, and you're like, hey, stop that. So what ways you navigate that particular moment in time to reduce the harm of threat? And we're going to be talking about harm reduction as a concept a little in a bit. And of course, tertiary prevention, which is kind of the long-term response, what you're going to do in the long term, what maybe for it to never happen again, or maybe if it were to happen again, to lessen, again, the harm of it happening. And from my understanding, there's really no wrong time. Sorry, let me phrase my words. It's not wrong to necessarily focus on one more than the other. I mean, of course, different contexts and different situations call for different strategies. But if you're the type of person that feels like either I address the threat or I don't address the threat, the kind of binary of like either I face it or I ignore it, you can actually have these kind of like nuanced things you could do before, after, and certainly during. Sometimes people forget the tertiary care. I do a lot of self-defense workshops where we talk about the same spectrum. And when we talk about like bystander intervention, or even just like coming out, like if you were in a physical altercation of some kind, people sometimes forget the importance of things like tertiary prevention, just like self-care, mental care, making sure that you can kind of come back and navigate the world as you can. All of these things are examples of ways of intervening or preventing threat. And so there's really a wide range of things that we can do. When we think about our own safety, we like to think of it as kind of this like big tapestry of experiences and skills that we all know. In my self-defense workshops, we like to say that, no one attending is necessarily a black belt, but we do believe that everyone here is a master of their own self-defense. You know what you need to do to get by, and we're not putting a value on it per se. We're just saying that you've made it so far. Not to say that it was easier or harder, or that, not to put a value on it, but just to say that you have some sense of survival. And in some way, you have been doing threat modeling all your life, unless you're someone who is completely free of threat, which, congratulations. Let me know how that life is going. That we've dealt with it, maybe threat modeling, some of us maybe in more organized fashion, some of us in a less organized fashion. But the point of the presentation today is to kind of organize some of these thoughts and feelings we have around threat, whether it be another person, a corporate actor, a state actor, whatever situation you may find yourself in. So if we were going to really just focus in on threat modeling, the 5 questions that make up threat modeling. Is that 5? Yes, 5 questions. What are you protecting? So what is the asset? Who are you protecting it from? Who is the actor? What resources do they have to take it from you? What are their capabilities? What are you willing to do to protect it? And that's not necessarily like admonishment, or that's not like a shamey question. Like, what are you willing to do to protect it? It's just a very simple, neutral question. What are you willing to do to protect it? Like, am I willing to start an all-out war with my roommate for eating my cakesters? Like, at the end of the day, they're just cakesters, and I have other things I'm doing with my life. Maybe a conversation would do. So that's what it means by what are you willing to do to protect it? And of course, what vulnerabilities you need to fill to better protect it. So once you've recognized the threat, or kind of the hole in your security plan, what can you do to address that and to grow your own capacity, and to prevent threat overall. Folks, sorry, I'm just going to check in every now and then. Folks can still hear me, right? Any of the Babycastles people?
Yeah, we're good.
Wonderful, thank you. Sorry. So for example, sometimes, some people respond well to like having those 5 questions on a list and just like writing down their answers like a worksheet. But we can kind of think of it also as like a bar test. Let's say if there's a piece of personal information that we are particularly, well, we want to be kept secure, whether it's, you know, our name, anything that we really define as personal information. Would you feel comfortable if someone overheard you talking about it at a bar? It's kind of the idea. It's kind of or a bar, concert. Well, I don't know. Maybe a bar is the best example. I don't love the bar example, but just for the sake of this presentation, what information wouldn't you want to express at a bar so others would overhear? Are there some people who you don't mind overhearing? Others people who you do mind overhearing, depending on the information? What are you going to do? Is like how are you going to navigate bar talk? I guess I don't go out to bars much. I don't know if bar talk is a thing. I think they're too loud. But in any case, is that the idea? So it doesn't have to be this kind of like highfalutin abstract concept of like threat, assess. It can be very personal. It can be, again, things we probably do every day when someone's maybe creeping up too close to us in a public setting, or just there's so many ways we kind of create boundaries and navigate our lives in day to day. So an example of this. John Wick, in the first film, John Wick, starring Keanu Reeves, the asset that he wanted to protect, and maybe this is up for debate, and maybe I'm going to get a lot of pushback on this during the Q&A or in the text box, but I think the asset in John Wick was, and hopefully this is not a spoiler, so close your ears if you haven't seen it, the asset was the honor of John Wick's dog. I'll say it like that. He's fighting for the honor of his dog, and if that's not enough for you to go watch the movie, definitely watch it. Who are you protecting it from? I watched all 3 movies in a row really fast. I don't remember which mafia it was, but certainly it was like a big group. It was a big gang. It was a big gang of folks he's going after because they did something to his dog. What resources do they have to take it from you? Again, they're a very well-resourced mafia group. They have contract killers and guns, and there's like a couple nightclub scenes. So John Wick definitely has his work cut out for him if he's trying to, you know, avenge the honor of his dog. What are you willing to do to protect it? So again, we might say to ourselves like, hey, someone did something really mean to my dog, like beyond mean, like I'm beyond words, I'm angry. But am I willing to go to the same extent that John Wick went to protect the honor of his dog? Am I willing to go after an entire criminal organization on my own with my mercenary skills to do so? Again, that's a question that's up to you. I don't know if that resonates with you. I certainly would not do that. I'd probably, at very least, write a journal entry about it first. But that's kind of the idea. If we kind of take John Wick as a model, what vulnerabilities you need to fill to better protect it? I actually forget. This is the one thing I forget about John Wick. I don't think he could have done anything differently. But with that aside, I think the point's already been made. And for those who are a bigger John Wick fan than me, maybe you can kind of help me out and relate some plot points to the presentation. Conversely, Keanu, starring Keegan-Michael Key and Jordan Peele, they are 2 folks who do not have the mercenary skills of Keanu. Their cat was stolen, which is extremely unfortunate. I think they also go after a criminal organization to do so, but they definitely go about it their own way, and they definitely make it work for themselves based on their own limitations, based on their own abilities or inabilities, and it's it's a comedy thrill ride through and through. So ways that we can break down threat modeling our day-to-day lives. Again, what are we protecting? Who are we protecting it from? What can they do to get it from us? What are we willing to do to protect it? And of course, what holes can we fill to make sure that there's a reduction of harm if they are to succeed, or if it's a repetitive threat, how to reduce the harm in the future. So if it does happen, it doesn't happen as hard, or maybe even at all. It's at this point in our presentation, so that's kind of the general overview that we like to give of threat modeling. It's pretty simple in itself. 5 questions you ask yourself. At this point, we like to introduce this concept of holistic security, which is this great book that was written by this group, Tactical Tech Collective, which has a lot of great guides and resources for folks starting off and like trying to understand their cybersecurity and their data and themselves in the online world. But they wrote this book called Holistic Security, which I think the original context was to help NGOs kind of come up with security plans, especially NGOs in politically fraught situations where maybe they're seeing kind of like state suppression of some sort. And they came up with this model of holistic security, holistic being that there may be a particular context that people are approaching this presentation. Like you have a particular something in mind, whether it's, oh, I came here to learn some digital security tips for talking about protest, or some digital security tips about being in a demonstration of some sort. And holistic security just kind of asks us to take a step back and kind of consider the situation wholly, and not solely as my physical security, my emotional security, and my digital security are 3 separate spheres, but very much interconnected. Going so far as to say that it's hard to have good digital security without having a good understanding of our own physical security and needs, and of course our emotional well-being and health. One example that we give at our presentations is, there's someone that, let's say, they work a double shift, wake up early, get home late, have enough time for dinner, but then they just kind of like pass out on the couch. Understandable, very long day. We just feel like that person's not going to take the time to be like, oh, hey, I'm on my last spoon for the day. I'm going to make sure all my passwords and I'm going to make sure all my passwords are up to snuff. I'm going to make sure that I have the best passwords. I'm going to spend the rest of my night doing that. It's not impossible. Some people do. And kudos to those who do find like the little bit of energy here and there to like improve their security models. But for the rest of folks, what that means is in taking care of our physical needs, which are very real, we could neglect our digital or even sometimes our emotional needs. So this idea of threat modeling and of course holistic security, thinking about how everything's related, how the digital is related to the physical, how it makes you feel, it is very important. And of course how digital security affects us emotionally. There's really so many, permutations that we can each think of these 3 areas interacting. And so we're going to move forward with this idea in mind: physical, digital, psychosocial, all very much related, all define our security model, part of our security model. And yeah, just to say that threat is valid. I think sometimes we have conversations around threat with ourselves as individuals or with others in a group. And again, threat is very subjective. What you might find threatening for very real reasons, someone else might not find as threatening. And I think the worst case scenario is sorry, one second. As I mentioned in the intro, there's a couple cats that are trying to meet up here on my end, and they're not behaving too well. Okay, sorry, separated them. They're fine. They're just, getting to know each other. So when having conversations about threat, sometimes with other people, you might be in a group, whether that's an organizing group or whatever, a group at work, and someone's like, well, what if... I've just been reading a lot about police surveillance, so I'm going to use this example. What if they bring out the LRAD? The LRAD being the long-range acoustic device, I believe, that police use to basically destroy the hearing of attendees, or at the very least send out very loud announcements to folks. So you're concerned, let's say hypothetically, about the LRAD system, or this kind of like police boombox that just breaks your eardrums. And someone else is like, oh, that's not I don't think it's a big deal. And that's it. And I feel like a lot of conversations do go like that, where one person's like, I'm worried about this thing, and someone else is like, well, I'm not worried about this thing, and that's it. And it creates kind of like a silencing effect, I feel like, in group settings, where people don't feel as open about expressing what their fears are, what they believe is going to be a threat. And so starting off from the premise that all threats are valid, whether or not they will be highly likely, that's a different story that's what we're trying to figure out. But threat is inherently valid. We feel threat. And sometimes in our trying to, even for ourselves, we may sometimes tell ourselves, oh, you're overreacting, you're thinking about it too much. And of course, that's your own conversation to have with yourself. But sometimes we might, in an attempt to ignore the threat, underestimate, overestimate, and find ourselves in a position and having to react to that threat in some form, whether because we ignored it and it happened, or because we maybe overplanned it and another aspect of our plans got messed up because of it. So treating threat as valid, keeping it as kind of a part of conversation, whether it's in a group setting, in a group project of some sort, I think is beneficial in the long run. It's great for creating, I think, safe spaces and communicative spaces between individuals and strangers and groups. If facilitated properly, I think it could be a very good conversation. It's kind of a regular conversation. I think it puts people at ease because people feel heard and people feel like their feelings of threat are being addressed, and that's super important. So starting from there. So the Holistic Security book, which is available for free, should have mentioned that, available for free on the Tactical Tech website, kind of takes apart the 5 questions and shuffles them up and puts in these kind of activities to help us kind of better define our security models and our threat models. First and foremost is, they say, the understanding of the context and situational awareness, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because I think people coming to this workshop, they have some sense of the context situational awareness that they're in, or that maybe you're thinking of a specific one. But they just reiterate that it's good to, get all sides in the sense of political, economic, scientific, technological, legal, environmental, whether the news is national, like Donald Trump does something, or something is hyper-local, like Bill de Blasio does something. It all could have an effect on our lives and our day-to-day, the way we navigate the world. So it's just good to keep those in mind when considering threat. Situations change constantly, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. It's just a good idea to keep abreast of them as part of your threat planning models. Step 2, actor and information mapping. So this is where we kind of start mapping out, like, who is the threat? Who is the threat, but not solely who is the threat, but who can maybe help us at this juncture. I think when we think of threat modeling threat, especially if we just take those 5 questions just at face value, we're always thinking of a threat acting upon us. And depending on how big that threat is, it could feel super scary to think about. It could feel, again, overwhelming. But it's good to recognize that actors, in a sense, people who are involved in this project or this situation or this context, can be allies. They can also be opponents. And it's just part of the process where you as an individual or as a group kind of understand who are your opponents and who are your allies. So opponents, again, hypothetical. I always forget to come up with one. Let's say we're making a community garden and we're threat modeling. And the community garden is, let's say it's a squatted piece of land and we're gardening it and we're trying to make it prosper and thrive. But we have some concerns about, different actors who might come in and try to do stuff with it. In that situation, some opponents might be maybe if the city is not into you squatting a piece of land for gardening. Some allies might be some other local gardens, other local groups that are very much interested in community gardening. So it's really in that sense. And I think the great thing about the spectrum of allies specifically is that it forces you to really specify the actor. So I think sometimes when we think about threat, like I go to a protest. The threat I'm thinking of today is the state. That can be very overwhelming. So certainly, the state is a very powerful entity at the end of the day, but it does have many factors to it. So when you say the state, are you talking about a local politician? Are you talking about local PD? Are you talking about like outside of New York City, like state representative state? So when we talk about state, it's also good to kind of just break down who are opponents or active opponents, and really separating the difference. It might seem minuscule, especially when you're in the middle of a high intense situation. But these things, as we'll see later, can help us kind of prioritize what we're going to do first, because we may in fact have multiple threats in our lives or in whatever project we might be involved in. So to focus on just one, or to focus on one big overarching opponent, is better than nothing, but might be kind of counterproductive when we try to split it apart. I like to put this in because they have a really great way of organizing information. Sorry, let me be more specific. In the Tactical Techless Security Guide, they have some great charts on how to organize information, because when we think about, let's say, if our information, personal, group, otherwise, we feel is threatened, where do we begin? What does that mean? Like, I mean, if you're part of a group that has like one working file, maybe that's the extent of the information you're concerned about getting out or getting infiltrated in some sense. But if you're a more complicated organization, like in this example with NGOs, you might have a lot of sensitive files, information that you need to hide, and so, or at least you need to keep private. So how do you even begin to organize it all? They do a good job of differentiating between information at rest in this guide, which is things that are, I'm just going to say things that are stationary versus things that are kind of digital and move around. Before I can really nerd out on this guide, I'm just going to move through these steps right quick, just for time. And now we talk about step 3, security indicators versus threat. So basically, this is the idea that the threat is the potentiality. It's the hypothetical that we're thinking of. We may be at our garden, again, our squatted garden, and every time we leave, we may notice that there's this like really weird van that just like is parked outside always, all the time. And we might get some feelings about that. And at this point, the difference between security indicator versus threat is not so much that that van is inherently up to something malicious. It's just the idea that we feel something is off. And this could be something negative, like a creepy van outside of your garden, or it could be something positive, people leaving, I was going to say compost, but nobody wants that. People are going to leave flowers. I don't know. Community members leave flowers outside your garden. That's kind of out of the ordinary, but kind of a nice thing. So when we talk about security indicators, we talk about things that just kind of get our attention, make us think, is this a big thing or could this be a small thing? And making sure to keep track in some form as a group through some kind of logging, or just by yourself, just making sure that it doesn't get ignored, that it doesn't get glossed over entirely. I think a part of this conversation is definitely how people use just kind of like cognitive defense mechanisms to just help navigate their day. Sometimes we ignore threat because, again, there's a lot of other stuff. We ignore a particular threat because there's a lot of stuff going on and we just can't focus on it. So this is kind of hopefully a little bit of a leeway. Instead of focusing on the threat or all the threats all the time, we just kind of have a conversation with ourselves, with the groups, saying that something's out of the ordinary. Maybe we should keep an eye on that. And of course, this is an example of a log. I'm just going to skip this for now. The kind of like, they got these really nice threat graphs that you can fill out. If you're a very visual person, or if you're really into handouts and worksheets, this is a great guide for you. But I think we get to the 4th step, which I think is definitely the most important part. So the threat matrix, which is a very cool name. As we see here on the x-axis, we have impact, and on the y-axis, we have likelihood. And this is, in fact, where the conversation begins. So everything up until now was information gathering, it was research, it was just making space to have these conversations. Now the conversation can begin. Our garden has a lot of different threats. We're not necessarily there with a permit, so any day we could get evicted. So maybe the landlord could be a threat, whoever owns the land. Maybe local PD who's coming on behalf of the landlord. Maybe the landlord got people on his own to come by and cause trouble. We have many different threats. It's a very active situation. Things keep changing. And anything, it just feels like without addressing it, anything could happen at any given time. So a conversation around the threat matrix is, whether by yourself, just prioritizing what you want to address first and foremost. What do you think is more likely, more important? So for example, the landlord says he's going to come tomorrow and rip out all our plants. We might think that's a high likelihood, middle likelihood. Certainly the impact would be high if someone ripped out all of our plants, as opposed to like an aphid infestation, which is like pretty impactful, but maybe not as pressing as someone coming in to just destroy everything. So that's what I mean by prioritizing threat. So you acknowledge it, you maybe save it for later, you realize it is something to work on, but that there is maybe a hierarchy of things that you want to protect first. There's a priority of things you want to protect first. And this conversation within groups probably looks like, you know, one person might think it's very likely that the landlord will come tomorrow and rip out all the plants. Someone else will think it's unlikely. So the conversation is kind of finding, based on the research in steps 1 through 3, based on kind of group knowledge, based on the space for conversation you created to have this talk, it's kind of like maneuvering and navigating and trying to figure out where on this chart something like that would actually go down. So threat matrix. So we don't think of threat simply as how bad it is or isn't, but also how likely it is or isn't, which again, also can be very subjective at times. That's why I think conversation and communication is important. And of course, finally, security planning. That idea being, you know, you create a plan and you also begin to address gaps and vulnerabilities. You break down what you're doing by objective as opposed to, so certainly we're starting a community garden, but let's say there's an aspect to it. Okay, let's take 2 different actors. So let's say the landlord versus a local state rep who just doesn't like this idea of a group of people just gardening. Their objectives might be similar: to end the garden, to close the garden. The landlord, again, is sending his goons. So the threat identified is the goons are coming tomorrow. The representative might have other means of trying to socially pressure you or legally pressure us out of the situation. So understanding what our resources are currently, what resources do we need, how could we respond in an emergency situation, and of course, taking time to think about our self-care and well-being, because again, mental health, emotional health, physical health is very much part of our security plan. So not things that have to be included all the time, but just things that I think, especially in situations I've been in previously, would have been welcome when things kind of fell apart or when the threats came through in some form. And of course, it's not necessarily just a reason to think about gaps or vulnerabilities. It's also a good time to think about what's working for you. Who are your allies? What do you have working for you? What's on your side already, so that you can build from there rather than feeling you're starting from the ground. This is our meow break. So, pros and cons of harm reduction. It's harm reduction. Threat modeling. Sorry. Pros, cons. This is a very new presentation. First time. I don't know if you can see that, but we're doing good. The pros and cons. Let's talk about pros and cons and harm reduction. So, threat modeling is not a reason to lament, but an opportunity to understand. That's a quote from me. I said that this morning, and I thought that was pretty neat. What I mean by that is that I think sometimes people approach threat modeling with the idea that threat modeling will in itself help. Certainly, it will give them confidence in whatever situation they're facing. But threat modeling in itself might not be the the tool to solve the threat, or at the very least, it might not be the tool through which you completely nullify the threat. That, in addition to the fact that there's a lot of different factors in our lives that we have a lot of different responsibilities to ourselves, to other people, that might get in the way from us of making like a very super simple single decision about, I'm going to a demonstration, this is what I'm bringing, this is what I'm not bringing. For some people it's easier, for some people it's more obvious, sure. For some people it's harder, and I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not this kind of binary of, well, let's take the phone at the demo, for example. And this one that I was most worried about. So if you feel like I'm completely wrong, definitely let me know in the chat, and I definitely want to learn more. But there is the narrative that I think is well represented by this flyer. The ride is one night, but metadata lasts forever. It's generally an idea to be aware of the online information that you send out about a event, whether protest or otherwise. Certainly we see in recent protests, FBI and local PD using social media, like leaning on it a lot to like find people at protests or demonstrations. So it's a very real thing. At the same time, you might not be you might be, I don't know, some high schooler going to their demo for the first time, or someone who is responsible for taking care of someone, or someone or some animal. And you might have a very real reason to keep your phone on you at all times. Does that mean that you shouldn't go to the demo because all the good demonstrators don't bring their phones, and if you bring the phone, you won't be a good demonstrator? Not necessarily so. There's just pluses and minuses to each strategy. Meaning to say that the folks without the phones, pros and cons could be, they can feel more secure about not, maybe being tracked in a particular space. But could also be harder for them to communicate with comrades if something wasn't set up beforehand, some kind of alternative system or means. On the other hand, if you keep your phone on you, it allows you to, connect with folks. You can tweet your thoughts. You can take notes. You can do whatever you do on your phone that usually helps you feel okay in public situations, at least for me. If you're, let's say, a legal observer, it could be an opportunity to like document something happening. But then, of course, you are open to all these forms of, in the case of demonstration, police or state surveillance. We don't necessarily have time to go through all of them today, but again, the EFF has a great street surveillance guide that goes through all the different types of potential types of technology that police departments use across the U.S. to keep track of citizens, protesters, which is to say that even through threat modeling, there won't be a easy answer. I'd say there'd be an easier answer. You prioritize things for yourself. You say what's most important to you, what's less important, and you act accordingly to that. But here we like to bring in the idea of harm reduction, and this is a big quote. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but harm reduction. I use this quote because it comes out of drug intervention. I guess social sciences as well. But this is just the idea that we might not be able to save the cakesters. Let me go back to the cakesters because maybe I'm just hungry. I might not be able to save all my cakesters, whether like 2 or 3 in a pack. Maybe if I intervene at certain points, they'll eat 1 cakester and I'll have 2 left. Again, I am at a loss of 1 cakester. But if we kind of extrapolate that to kind of bigger, more consequential situations, a little bit of harm reduction can go a long way. Whether something as small as whether someone is, if they are arrested with or without a phone, depending on your security model, that can make a big difference for you and also the people you socialize with and the people you work with. So in a sense, harm reduction threat modeling isn't just, again, for yourself, it's also for your community and the people you interact with, and another kind of actor to keep in mind when you're thinking about all this for yourself. So I've been talking a lot. We're gonna leave room for some questions right now, and I just wanted to overview a few things. So again, I also don't like that I've been talking for so long. Usually we kind of have a nice back and forth at our events, but threat modeling. Basic idea here is that there's many ways to approach it. You probably do it in your day-to-day already in some form. It's not a perfect science. You might, research for months and still not have all the information around the specific threat. For example, something that we couldn't say last week in New York is that we knew what the NYPD was buying or spending on and using surveillance equipment for, but now this past week, the City Council passed the Post Act, and now hopefully in the future that would mean that citizens have more transparency around the surveillance technology that the NYPD purchases and uses on the citizens of New York. So some information might come out later, and you still might have to act. So it's less about finding an answer and more like creating a path for yourself. Wherein everything else might seem overwhelming, you have a lot to do, there's a lot that could go wrong. This is kind of just a way to address it. And of course, the most important thing is whether you take this particular form of threat modeling or not. Just, I think in general, prioritizing security in conversations, security planning conversations, creating safer spaces for folks to discuss security. Sometimes it can be really hard to talk about what you feel threatened by, or to be vulnerable in front of a group of people. And of course, talk often. Situations change. This is not a one-time thing. Certainly one conversation is better than none, but having a space where people can talk about threat and they're feeling a threat and really what like irks them out about something around the project can be very vital, and I think overall adds builds stronger bonds between members of a group. And this I put in because I've definitely heard this before. Having a conversation on security isn't antithetical to action, to risk, to progress, or success. I think sometimes there's this idea of like, there's not a lot of time to plan this thing that we're planning. We only got to talk about the logistics. The logistics may be an important thing to talk about. There's always logistics to plan, always. But just prioritizing security a bit more can actually help the mood of the group, the mental health of the group, and hopefully over the long time will reduce issues of burnout that people sometimes have when working in these type of scenarios and situations. So with that being said, I'm going to, I don't know what I'm going to do. We have a few minutes for Q&A. I'll put up the slide for the resources that I can talk about. And I don't know how the folks here want to do it, but I can take some questions or...
Yeah, I can ask you some questions in the chat.
Cool.
If that works.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
We're gonna have to take like 2 minutes right before 4 so that we can restart our Instagram stream because of the 1 hour limit. So we'll just do like a question or two, and then if you still have questions, we'll hopefully have another longer section when it comes around to 5 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
The first question we have right now, we have a question. What about protecting yourself from stingrays?
Yeah.
And clarification was that's the term for IMSI catchers.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me just pull up my notes because I knew someone was going to ask about IMSI. What am I looking for? Oh, right. Right. So
Thanks, Learning Collective put some good things in the chat too for this.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Tech Learning Collective, as always, filling out the chat with some good info. Yeah, so it's protection against stingrays. So stingrays, the idea, these towers that are kind of set up, there's different forms of them. There's passive cell site simulators and active cell site simulators. I'm probably butchering this, but the idea is that these are different types of cell site simulators that mimic the tower that your cell phone or your cell phone connection usually connects to, and it kind of either tries to kind of suck up the information being transmitted from your phone to the actual cell phone tower in between, or it can or can actively listen in to phone calls or get the contents of your SMS messages, especially if they're unencrypted, can see the websites visited when you were in a particular area, metadata about calls and duration about calls. And this is a technology that's become more and more popular, especially in police departments across the US. Certainly, there have been reports about it used in New York City with the NYPD. And yeah, I think that in itself is probably like an hour presentation. Like what are some of the threats around just the IMSI, the Stingray, and what can we do about it? Knowing that they might be deployed and we might not know about them, so maybe it'd be best to assume that they are being used in some contexts. And the other question being, even with that in mind, what are we willing to do about that, faced with that information? And that could be a lot of answers. That could be still go to the protest, maybe without a cell phone, still go to the protest and not use a flip phone with basic unencrypted like SMS texting, maybe use something that's more secure, a smartphone with a more secure app and more secure features where it's kind of hard for people to jump in the middle of the conversations we're having with others. Does it mean, I don't know, for some legislation in New York, certainly it meant passing a New York Post Act, which again doesn't outlaw stingrays per se, but allows for some transparency between citizens and the NYPD's use of stingrays. What can we do? What can I do to protect against stingrays? I don't know. It's hard for me to say. It's hard for me. I would feel weird giving advice because again, everyone's situation is different. Everyone values their information differently. And so for me, it would be just to learn as much as I can about them. If you're in a jurisdiction where you've heard it's being used, be extra careful, just kind of be aware. But there's a lot of really great guides. Again, EFF has some on Stingray and IMSI catchers that could hopefully kind of better inform all of us. And I'm sure there's people here on this chat that can give plenty more information than I can about maybe steps you can take to mitigate the harm of interacting with the IMSI catcher, if that helped.
Thanks. We have like 3 minutes left before we have to break. We'll keep streaming. The question is, I usually act as a legal observer or licensed medic during protests. How do I protect the digital rights of whom I'm observing / treating? I find that a lot of people are saying not to record phases.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting conversation. I'll be quick about it. But I again, definitely there's a lot to be said here. I think it's super interesting that the conversation around what people should and shouldn't film at protests has developed. I think back in 2014, I heard some stuff like that. There were some people being like, we really shouldn't film folks at protests because that information is then put online usually, and then state entities look through that information and try to identify people, which is all things that they do. And I think at least back then, even 6 years ago, people were like, but that's, we live in a phone world. How are we going to avoid this? We should just like in for the penny, in for the pound, which I think is an understandable, but like the worst way to approach threat and threat modeling. There are some apps like Signal, I think recently added a feature that allows blurred faces. And I think just generally, even without solely relying on apps, just being aware of what we're filming, where we're doing with intentionality, whether that's what we film, how we film it, who we film, understanding the ramifications of such things, not just the positive ramifications of, not just the opportunity that come out of documenting something, but also the threats that come out of maybe exposing someone. And of course, this is the part that I think gets overlooked sometimes, especially maybe at an action because it's really busy. But when we talk about bystander intervention, let's say you see someone on the street getting harassed by someone and then you like film the incident. there's a measure of consent that's super important as well. Asking the person what do they want done with the film, how do they want to handle it, even just sending it to them, if that's something that's an option or that's available, so to be able to not assume the other person's security model and just post wildly on social media, but to actually work out something that might work, see if they want to post it, see if they don't want to post it, if possible. I understand that's not always possible, but it's definitely difficult. And I think in these high situations, I think people understand that there are going to be cameras, that there are going to be legal observers. I think people do take some steps to mask up or to kind of anonymize themselves the best they can. But it's also a very difficult thing to strike a perfect balance in groups of like thousands of people when a lot of stuff is happening. It's not a perfect answer. I don't think there's a clear answer, but it just promotes us kind of getting to know the situation a little bit better. Yeah, that's all I got. And before we finish up, I will post these resources because I know we got to reset the Instagram feed. I'll post these resources that we use on the thread, and you can look at them then. So the resources that we use for this presentation and otherwise, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's it. Thank you for having me. I'm down to answer questions. You can email us at cypurr@protonmail.com. Cypurr.nyc is our website. We do events. Check us out, and thanks for having me today. And everyone, be safe and have a good one.
Great. If you wanna stick around till the end of David's talk, we can also make another little space for questions. Then, if people have more things that they want to talk to, I don't know. Considering, if you have to go or whatever, that's okay too. But
no, that's perfect. I'll stick around because I definitely want to hear David's presentation too.
All right, and also I'm gonna reset the Insta stream now. It should take like 2 minutes. We'll be right back, and I'll let you know when we're ready to go again.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
We'll have our little intermission. Stay tuned.
Cool. Yeah,
Great.
I'm pretty much ready whenever.
Cool. I'll intro you then. Yay. So back again, we have David Orta from Freedom of the Press Foundation. So here's our description. Independent journalists can work more with autonomy than many reporting to an established newsroom, but that also entails taking on more roles and thinking about the risks associated with them. I hope my internet connection is okay, by the way. David will discuss how to model risks to independent journalists and what steps you can take to mitigate those risks. That's there we go. So David, whenever you're ready,
Cool.
just hop on.
Thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides that I'm going to show. All right. And so this is what I have. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. So a little bit of background. Cool. Freedom of the Press Foundation is an organization that works with journalists of all stripes to help them with digital security, among other things. We also work with a number of independent journalists and help them, advise them on digital security, especially in the situation where they might not have the full kind of resources of a IT department and security advisories, security advisors, etc. So there's a lot of words that kind of have a lot of overlap in their meaning. Threat modeling is a term that is used heavily in the information security industry, in the cybersecurity industry, and the military. So we generally lean towards using the kind of more civilian-y sort of verbiage of a risk assessment. But essentially a lot of the same concepts apply, and some of these actually carry over from what was mentioned earlier, and some of the stuff that, for example, Tactical Collective has spoken about at length, or has written about in length as well. So there's a few things to kind of think about in terms of how do you categorize things that can happen, and so the different actors that are involved. So the first one, of course, being is yourself. As an independent journalist, thinking about your assets, your resources. Then, of course, there's thinking about, who are you worried about? What situations would be particularly damaging? And how do we measure that in this case? And then, of course, there's, what could we do about it? Knowing what different risks are, what are some of the steps we can take to mitigate that? So this is just kind of a high-level overview of the different things we'll talk about. And a lot of that, of course, repeating a lot of what's already been said, thinking about a few different questions that you basically ask yourself, thinking about, what do I have to protect? Just like you would in any journalistic practice, you want to protect your sources and make sure that you honor whatever agreement you have with them. This can also mean things like your ability to do your work. So that can mean your physical assets, like your smartphone, for example. If your smartphone, falls into the ocean, that basically makes you not able to do your work and not able to do journalism. So that is a concern to have as well. Thinking about adversaries, can mean a pantheon of different things, and we'll go through kind of some of the more common examples, some of the recurring characters that we see in a lot of our work. This, in many cases, as we're talking about protests in many examples, can include things like a police force. But in this case, as we're doing investigative work, outside of the context of the actual action, we also want to think about the way we investigate different actors, including not necessarily police forces, but groups like counter-protesters, for example, and how to do that safely. There's also the matter of the variation of resources that an adversary can have. There tends to be a lot of guesswork that tends to be done around this, mostly because in many cases we don't have full visibility into what our potential adversaries can do. The Post Act was mentioned earlier, and that basically, after it kind of comes into play, will at least let us have to guess less in terms of what the NYPD can do specifically. But there's still other potential adversaries that we might not have the same visibility into. But it's worth thinking about, just looking at the stories of what has happened in the past, what has been used or leveraged against journalists. And what is the kind of threat actor that has that capability? Then, of course, there's likelihood. This varies a lot based on what kind of beat you're covering. If you are investigating counter-protesters, chances are, a counter-protester will not want you to be investigating them. So that is, the likelihood of you being a target for that kind of risk is a little bit more elevated than it would be if you were, somebody covering the weather, for example. And then, of course, there are resources. So this isn't a value judgment or like necessarily even a call to action on specifically like what you should or shouldn't do so much as just, thinking about what kind of resources, taking an inventory of what resources we have in terms of time, money, and technical skill to be able to level up our digital security. Independent journalists generally don't have the same level of material resources that an established newsroom would have. So as far as like, the ability to have, different devices that would be ideal for certain situations bought, for example, is a little bit lower. Time, of course, if you're freelancing or if you're working for a big newsroom, that is something that journalists have very little of. But luckily, though, in terms of like technical acumen, our brains, nobody is born, being a security expert. The way our brains work is really, really, really cool. They are a neural network. They're basically the squishy neural network that we can basically just work on essentially infinitely. So that is one of those things that we have as an asset that we can just keep growing. And we're going to do a little bit of that today. So going into, what you're protecting, thinking about the context of what your investigation is, who are your sources. This can mean a few different levels of confidentiality. This could be an anonymous source that you really want to protect, whistleblower, for example. This might not necessarily be that spicy. It could just be, somebody that's on the record saying like, I have a public statement about this thing, somewhat less of a big deal. So there is like, a level of variation between, how sensitive a particular source's communications can be. Then, of course, there are things like assets. So beyond kind of the physical assets of the devices we have, we also have, this, collection of records of communication with our sources. We have, the passwords that we use to get into our own accounts. So the way those are being stored, might be a concern there. Any notes or other kind of like materials that we have collected on our investigations that we want to have on background, maybe don't want to publish, something we want to protect as well as an asset. And then going into our example, in this case, thinking about a freelancer or somebody just kind of contracting for a small independent media organization, there's, this is just kind of repeating what I've already said, but essentially, a little bit maybe low on time, a little bit low on money, but, with some practice can level up significantly on technical skills. And then, of course, thinking about who you're concerned about. And, of course, this will vary a lot depending on, who you're investigating. So we have, a few different examples that we'll talk about, each of which have, their own combinations of time, money, skill that they can deploy in as well. And, the kind of means of which they would deploy them, whether this would be through a legal process or through an extra legal process. So going through our pantheon of potential adversaries, we have, kind of the, thinking about any kind of game situation, whether it's chess or Halo, we have the kind of like, little pawns kind of adversary where there's not really a lot of, significant potential negative impact per unit, but maybe, in aggregate could be like a pretty big problem. So in this case, we might have, trolls or like haters, people that don't have a lot of technical skill, but might have a lot of free time in their hands to try to annoy you. In this case, they might be able to do things in terms of trying to research information about you as you traverse the internet. But as far as, the kind of like big scary things that we talk about police doing, they probably wouldn't have access to that kind of ability. Of course, then we can go all the way up to kind of like, super, super, super powerful adversaries that I think get talked about a little bit, maybe too much. Certainly these are a concern for some independent media makers. Our board of directors include Laura Poitras. And, the president of board of directors is Edward Snowden. So there are times and places where this is a concern. And, this is in many ways kind of a, a larger kind of chess piece, so to speak, in terms of like abilities and reach, technical skill, and resources, but usually working within within the limits of a certain legal framework, for example. Same thing in some cases with police. With the NYPD in particular, like this is, a potential adversary that has its own like intelligence agency, for example. There is some upcoming transparency in terms of what their abilities are, but we do have an idea of the kind of technological resources they might have an ability, in the works that they can deploy against you. And, in this case, generally speaking, and of course there's exceptions to this, but operating within, the bounds of what their lawyers would let them get away with, very different than, say, a troll or somebody else that would be working outside the law full time. Then, of course, we have, this emergent, or I guess not emergent, I guess it's been around for a while, but the idea of, like, a kind of, like, high-profile sort of, like, billionaire-type figure that has the ability to essentially investigate people investigating them. So we see this, in terms of deployment, in terms of, people that are celebrities that have been Me Too'd, investigating people that have accused them of wrongdoing, and also with big agriculture. So there's a lot of independent journalism being done to investigate factory farms, for example. And a lot of the owners of these massive factory farms don't like that. So there may be some other means deployed to investigate the investigators. So that's like another set of like concerns to think about, and another different set of assets and resources that could include things like private investigators, for example. And then, of course, there's, kind of more sort of extra-legal, sort of kids that are up to no good hackers. This can be, somebody that is working outside the law, but has a lot of technical skill, maybe not a ton of resources per se in terms of, money, but has the technical abilities to, do things like launch a phishing campaign, for example. All right, so let's talk about online investigations. So there's different set of risks for different situations. The same kind of things you would want to think about for what you do from your home on the internet are going to be a little bit different than, or probably a little bit different than what you would do, on the scene of a protest. So let's go over these two situations. So this first one, we have, the research of, in this case, I mentioned the example of counter-protest, for example, to include an example that isn't, that goes a little bit beyond what the police do. April, O'Neill, formerly of Channel 6 News, unfortunately was laid off. Media has changed a lot since the 80s, is now freelancing for a few different websites. And she's been asked to look into counter-protest movements that are trying to instigate violence at different actions. So a few different things that she'll be looking through include, shady websites, forums ran by hate groups, chat groups, which could include things like Discord groups, for example, and, just regular old, like, Twitter hashtags and seeing what's going on there. So let's talk about, some of the risk of just browsing some of the websites that we'll be thinking about. As we traverse the internet, through the internet, we have a connection that is made between us and the website we're connecting to. Much like the way a phone on your end dials a phone number to reach another phone, your computer or smartphone, when it's connecting to a website, will connect to its internet protocol IP address or IP address. These generally are tied to a physical place in the world. So if you are, for example, visiting a really terrible forum ran by white supremacist groups, for example, that the owner of that website would also generally see something akin to like a city block level of accuracy of what your physical location in the world is, which is a problem. VPNs in this case help mitigate some of that, and will help you essentially use somebody else's IP address as you traverse through the internet. So that same website would essentially just see a data center in New Jersey connecting to them, for example. This has some limitations, and I talked a little bit about some of these last week. But basically, or last time we did this, we have, you know, a sort of trust relationship that we have with our VPN that used to be in an internet service provider. So we decided, you know, hey, we don't want to broadcast our internet connection, but the privacy of all of our internet activities is now, you know, not under lock and key under our internet service provider, but now in a different trust relationship with a virtual private network provider. So we're not going to get into too much about how to pick one. We kind of did that last time. So I'll just like leave some resources here to talk about, you know, the nitty gritty of what to look for. So feel free to check those things out. And then we're thinking about, you know, what if we're not connecting to a forum or a website that's actually directly owned by the hate groups that we're investigating? So what if it's something like, you know, somebody's Discord group? You know, the Boogaloos or whatever don't own Discord, so they might not have the same visibility in terms of like what your IP address is, for example, there. But there's still other concerns to think about when doing these kinds of investigations and different kinds of like reasons to do that. There's a lot of, you know, very important stories that come out of somebody kind of looking into what these groups are doing from the inside. And, you know, a lot of these activities are happening online. So how does one do, you know, what was the virtual analog of this kind of physical, essentially, infiltration online? There's a lot of ways to do it well. There's a lot of ways to do it badly. Some of the ways, you know, some of the things to think about in terms of like, you know, of course, not using your real name, but also thinking about creating an online identity that's not tied to you is how that identity was originally created. So there is, if anybody is familiar with the term open source intelligence, the idea that you can collect a lot of intelligence about a person or a figure online based on what their presence is online. In addition to specific tools like Datasploit, for example, which would allow you to take advantage of certain features of the way social media websites work in order to sort of like virtually connect the red string on who is actually who online. So what does this look like? It looks a little bit like this. So this is an old website that no longer exists, but it is in essence like very similar to some of the tools that would exist elsewhere. This essentially looks at, you know, an email address or a phone number, and then looks through different websites to see whether there is a user that can be looked up with that email address or phone number. So if you're creating a, you know, online persona that isn't tied to your identity, but you registered it with your email address or with your regular phone number, that could be revealed in reverse by going through a tool like this. And a lot of this is made possible by the settings that are available within social media websites. So in Facebook, for example, you have, you know, beyond just, you know, whether or not your profile is even public or private or not, there's also the ability to look people up based on these kind of details. So based on things like email address or phone numbers that these tools take advantage of. And if you limit that lookup feature to not be available to like the entirety of the internet and limit it to, you know, friends, close friends, something that's a little bit more limited like that, that can help mitigate, you know, that kind of detail about you from surfacing. I would also just recommend using different sets of phone numbers and email addresses for different online personas, because that helps create a more clean separation of, you know, who you are within this group versus who you are in real life. And then, of course, Twitter has a, you know, another feature that does basically that. We also have like a few, like you may notice, like there's a few other things that we just kind of recommend for people in general. These are not necessarily, the ones that are not highlighted in red are not necessarily related to this specific use case, but are just some of the things that we'd like to include. You know, if you're already poking around your settings, we also have some recommendations around that. So Twitter, of course, has the same thing. Letting other people find me by email or phone number is something that we would recommend turning off, just to help, you know, mitigate against those kind of open source intelligence tools. Speaking of Twitter, there is a lot of things to think about as we, you know, cultivate a audience that will inevitably include a lot of people that hate us for speaking the truth. So in this case, some of the examples that people have gone after journalists and activists and others in this space has been to try to take over the account and do reputation damage. So in this case, DeRay McKesson had his Twitter account hijacked years ago. We don't know, or at least I don't know, whether the password was, you know, seized via either a phishing attack or, you know, password breach. But in this case, the code that was used to log in, the two-factor authentication code, which some of you have, heard a little bit about before probably, that gets texted to you to log in. In this case, his phone number was hijacked by an adversary that then, after knowing the password and having the phone number that 2FA code goes to, was able to log in as DeRay, impersonate him, and, hijack his account that way. Since then, Twitter now has the ability to log in with other modes of two-factor authentication. So instead of getting that text message through your phone, you can use an application to do that that's not tied to your phone number, like Authy, like FreeOTP. There's any number of these that will let you do basically the same thing, but not have to worry about whether somebody takes over your phone number or not. Although that's also another issue, and unfortunately that's something that is up to the phone carrier to protect. Many of them will require a password for support calls. If not, definitely recommend setting that up. And then, of course, there's thinking about, how do we prioritize these things as far as, wanting to protect the accounts that we have, where we might be talking to sources, where we might be talking to colleagues, we're sharing documents, for example. We have a lot of online accounts. And, we need to think about the reality of if we have limited time, then how do we prioritize these things? And in many ways, the way you can model that is thinking about, what asset do you need to get to all your other assets? And in this case, as my colleague Harlow would say, you're only secure as I forgot my password. And what that means is that, most websites that we have accounts for have a means of letting us reset our password. And what that means is we'll, say, hey, I forgot my password. Please send me an email that will let me reset a new password. Normally, we set up accounts with the same email address, so that means that they all go to the same place. And that's why that email address is, a particularly important account to protect. Because if somebody were to get a hold of that, then that means that they would be able to use to weaponize the I forgot my password functionality for all the other things you have an account for, to get into them. So that is something that we recommend looking into in terms of, the way we've seen these kind of attacks happen in the past, and wanting to, right off the bat, try to, cover as much attack surface as some would say. Then, of course, I mentioned two-factor authentication a little bit. That basically, for anybody that's not familiar with that, thinking about ways to protect your account that go beyond just a password. So many websites now will let you, log in with not just a password, but like a password plus something else. This can be a text message. This can be an app like Authy or Google Authenticator or FreeOTP. Or you can use like a hardware key, which we talk about at length at FPF a lot, and which we recommend for certain high-risk journalists. And you can do that here. Luckily, Twitter now supports all these options. They only support one hardware key, unfortunately, so that's unfortunate, but, better one than none. Kind of example, live action example of what this looks like. I think the design actually changed a little bit recently. So the buttons might be a slightly different shape, but this is, you get kind of the idea of what to look out for. And then, of course, we love talking about password managers a lot, and we're not going to, jump into password managers because that's its own kind of, workshop in and of itself. And especially, as we're thinking about, like, how do we do things as a group, a lot of these tools have different varying degrees of how well they work between people and teams. So, something to think about there. Okay, so now that we talked about, a little bit about how we want to protect our online identities, how we want to separate our online identities, one of the things that comes up a lot, and, was even mentioned as kind of a question in the last session is, some of the concerns that arise when we're actually in an action and covering it. So April is now covering a protest. She is an independent journalist, so she doesn't have the fancy full-size camera that she used to have when she worked for Channel 6. So she'll be using the same device to take photos, to talk to sources, to talk to her editors, and to talk to other reporters that she may want to check in with while she's there. So then, of course, and this is, kind of, I know this has already been a thing that we kind of talk about a lot, but it is one of those things that we want to emphasize is that luckily, so unfortunately, IMSI catchers are a thing. Police surveillance technologies like these allow them to essentially scoop up phone call data, like, where calls are being, sent to and who from, as well as text messages. Text message data. What I mean by text messages is not like things like WhatsApp messages or Facebook messages. I'm literally just talking about, very, very basic text messages that come with like any kind of phone that you would have, whether it's a Nokia 3310 or the newest iPhone. Many of them have, a lot of this technology has become very popular, unfortunately, and has become relatively ubiquitous in its availability and its use by different police departments across the U.S. And this is what it looks like. So just to kind of give you an idea of what it means to communicate without encryption. So what does it mean to talk to people via plain old green bubble text messages? It looks like this. Thinking about, our potential pantheon of adversaries and what capabilities they have. Unfortunately, this has, the potential to open it up to multiple adversaries. So beyond just the phone company, which definitely has a copy of our text messages here, which is represented by this little cloud, we also have other people that are on the wire, so to speak. So things like lawful interception, which could be like IMSI catchers. If you're using something that is the website equivalent or the web equivalent of text messages without encryption, that could bring in concerns of somebody on the Wi-Fi network. That's less of the case as much as it used to be 10 years ago. Thinking about an internet service provider as well as, hackers on the wire. So the modern age in this case, like going beyond just like what you would see in text messages and more in things like, for example, Twitter DMs, looks more like this. You have basically an encrypted connection to, let's say Twitter.com. Twitter.com has a copy of your text messages and DMs. They can read them, they can mine them for data, and show you relevant ads based on that if they want to, for example. The other people that are involved in this process, that are on the wire, cannot see what those DMs are because of the fact that they are encrypted so that only Twitter can see them. Thinking about, your different potential adversaries, this can mean a few different avenues of getting to that data. So an IMSI capture would not be able to get into your Twitter DMs. It does not have that capability because of that encryption. That being said, in this case, like thinking about legal actors that use law to get to what they want, that could mean things like, subpoenas might be a thing. So not necessarily like, tapping the wire, so to speak, but asking a judge to see if they could make Twitter fork over some DMs. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer, I'm not anybody's lawyer, so it's definitely not my forte, but just to think about, there's a whole other dimension beyond just the technical aspect to think about as we think about, the abilities of what our adversaries have. Of course, we can move beyond just encryption to the services that we use and use what is called end-to-end encryption to create, messages, content, things that are only readable by the intended recipient, ourselves, and absolutely nobody else, not even the provider of that app or service. This is an example of what that would look like. This is an example that my colleague Harlow likes to use, in this case, an older version of encryption called OTR that is still used by some people, even though it's kind of an antique, in my opinion. So in this case, there's still a little bit of metadata here. We have things like, a timestamp, a name. The protocol of the name is actually like the first three letters after that question mark. Theoretically, if there would be a profile photo there would be that there. But the actual message is unreadable even by the service that you're using it with. So this is basically end-to-end encrypted within a Google Hangout. And if you were to just look at what Google sees in that Google Hangout, they would see this, which is like not a lot, essentially, and definitely not what the message contents are. That is why we recommend using Signal. And I know this kind of comes up a lot and it gets, repeated so many times, and I'm so sorry for if you're like sick of hearing people telling you about Signal, especially if you've already downloaded it, and I'm like preaching to the choir. But it is like we do gravitate towards this because of the fact that it does sort of check all the boxes in terms of like a well-established protocol for end-to-end encryption that has been like court tested, that has been battle tested in terms of having an independent security audit. So yeah, check it out. Of course, that might not protect you if your phone gets confiscated. So that is another situation that we might think about that involves some but the same threat actors. So a police officer in a van with or in a helicopter with an IMSI catcher has different abilities than one that has physically taken your phone from you, and different technologies involved. So let's look at what some of those technologies might look like and what are some of those risks. Actually, yeah, these are a little bit in order. I apologize for that. But the idea is, like, essentially there was supposed to be a slide here kind of demonstrating some of the tools and gadgets that police have to, try to siphon up stuff that you have in your phone. Basically, there's a lot of tools made by companies like Celebrate, like GrayKey, that law enforcement can use to plug in a phone and try to extract the contents from it. The thing that thwarts that, if implemented effectively, is full disk encryption, or FDE, sometimes called file-based encryption, sometimes just called encrypting your phone. And this is useful for a few different reasons. One, it protects your data at rest. So if your phone is off, which is another kind of caveat to think about, somebody trying to connect that phone to a GrayKey or Celebrite device, if you have, if this has been implemented correctly, will protect the contents of that. The contents of your phone are essentially the closest one can get in the modern age to having a copy of your live consciousness. This is what we use to talk to everybody we know, especially now. This is our camera. This is our, chat system. This is our everything. So it is a very high value target. And this is like one of those things that I think I want to stress trying to protect a lot in these kind of situations. Because, as we're talking to sources, records of that communications, are in your phone. In addition to, so we mentioned, there's like a little line here for tampering resistance in this case, like being able to, security isn't just about confidentiality, but about other aspects. So thinking about not just confidentiality, but integrity and verification. So basically making sure that your phone itself has not been, hacked in some way to spy on you later on, essentially. Full disk encryption basically helps protect against those kind of risks as well. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit what that looks like. So we have full disk encryption on Android phones. This varies a lot because the Android ecosystem varies a lot in terms of manufacturer, in terms of OS version, in terms of the variation of, the variations of Android that are created for different phones. And even things like, what carrier settings are available. So most Android phones, especially newer modern Android phones, and those with the Android One certification, have the ability to be encrypted. And, it's usually a simple process. It is battery intensive. So if you're doing this is something that I would recommend, either like having the phone plugged into a wall or having connected to a battery. But essentially makes it so that, if somebody uses these kind of forensic tools on your phone, they wouldn't be able to extrapolate the data that lives within them. And this can include things like signal messages. Signal messages are encrypted so that only you and the recipient can see them. But what that really means is that you and the recipient's phones can see them. So somebody that has access to your phone would also be able to access, a lot of application data, not necessarily just Signal, but there are other apps as well. So that's why it is a good idea to think about encryption, not just in transit as it traverses through, a cell connection or the internet, but also as it lives on our devices. With iOS, it's already kind of set up, so there is no unencrypted option there, which is great, at least on, every modern iOS phone, I think since like 2015, possibly earlier. So you're in luck there. One thing to think about is that, a lot of these tools count on passcodes to try to get into the phone. And if you have a short passcode, you can have, a massive fortress with like emotes and alligators and whatever. But if the key code to get through the front gate is 1234, that's not going to offer too much protection. So let's talk about that screen unlock code. A lot of these tools, Gray Key, Celebrate, etc., will do things like try to, so there's a few different aspects to them, including things like looking at the SIM card, which we have a guide on at freedom.press/training if you want to check that out, in terms of like steps to take to protect your phone before going to a protest. But in terms of what these kind of devices do, they try to unlock the phone first before trying to extract the data that lives in it. And the way they try to do that is by trying to guess what the passcode is. And in this case, there's a few different approaches that they take to that. One is they try doing what is called just a brute force attack, meaning that they will go through all possible combinations of a length. So a 6-digit code, for example, could be relatively, is advertised as a feature in some of these tools as something that they can crack. Whereas a, alphanumeric code or like a 12-digit numerical code is something that, goes beyond the capabilities within a reasonable amount of time to try to crack, so to speak, because the amount of combinations needed to go through are an exponential, function. So in this case, the longer the better. That being said, these tools also generally have their own kind of guesswork that they do that is based on what people's common passcodes are. So they basically have lists of what are called dictionaries that will be tried first to see like, hey, we know that like a huge number of people use these very common codes as their screen unlock code. Let's try that first, which is why these things are usually very quick at cracking them, because unfortunately that is, there isn't password 123 is still a very, very, very common computer password, and 0000000 is also a very common smartphone password. And then of course there's thinking about oh, this has already been mentioned. Sorry about these things being a little bit out of order. Another way that people will get into devices, thinking about maintaining the integrity of what we have in them and access, is through vulnerabilities that are known about these different phones. So some of these tools might include some that are used to try to take advantage of a weakness or vulnerability within Android or iOS that may have later become known and patched. And what that means is, like, realistically, all software ships broken. Like, that's kind of the unfortunate universal truth of the infrastructure that we all depend on, is that most apps will have bugs, and the way that apps have fixes made to those bugs is through the update system. So if you do see updates to your to your iOS or Android, or to your web browsers, for example, that's kind of one of the ways to help mitigate around software that takes advantage of those known vulnerabilities. Of course, thinking about confidentiality and integrity, we also think about a third aspect of security, which is availability. Tends to be a little bit neglected in a lot of discourse in cybersecurity, but the idea of, you being able to have a voice to be able to do your job as a journalist depends on people not being able to stop you from doing that. And in this case, thinking about, even if the damage that is done by, even if there's no damage to somebody taking your phone because it's full disencrypted to the contents, there's still the fact that you might not have, tons of money to spend on a new phone, or you might have lost a lot of data, communications with a source, notes, etc., that are important to your work. And, sorry, I'm just slowly losing my voice, so I apologize if my throat sounds a little bit horsey. Basically, the way that we want to think about this is by implementing a process of having backups in place before an action. A lot of the things, and this is true for password managers, true for a lot of things, is the way I generally discuss these kind of security measures is less about, not just the security lens in terms of just these are definitely things you have to do them now, and more of just a benefit of having the peace of mind that knowing that the anxiety of certain situations is mitigated to some degree based on the fact that, hey, I know that I don't have to worry about forgetting my password because I have a password manager. I can get into it if I need to. I know that if my phone drops into the ocean, I can, my notes are safe. I can get to them. So there's a lot of, psychosocial aspects to think about it. As was definitely mentioned in length earlier, that this also plays into, that this also is a benefit to. So thinking about backups, there's a few caveats to the way these are done. And unfortunately, the way big companies like Apple and Google want you to do backups in a lot of ways, or Microsoft, is to do their cloud service. So iCloud, Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive, for example. And the vulnerability that is introduced with that in this case is that it opens you up to certain abilities of an adversary that have legal judicial means. So in this case, thinking about law enforcement, thinking about the court system, thinking about subpoenas, and what can be reached with them. So in this case, like if you're using iCloud, for example, and if you're backing up to iCloud, that means that Apple has all the same stuff that you would have on your computer. So that means that somebody that knocks on Apple's door, like I'm sure they have their own lawyers, they would fight it probably, depending on what their privacy policy says. Again, I'm not a lawyer. But the technological ability to have that be essentially revealed to a potential adversary through the legal system exists and is created by having those available in Apple's infrastructure. So rather than backing up to iCloud, we try to recommend backing up locally to your own computer. So with iOS, and this is just changed, unfortunately, I'm not on Catalina on Mojave because of reasons, but you do have the ability in this case still to use either iTunes or now Finder to have a backup made on your computer that is also encrypted on your computer. So you can actually plug in your iPhone or your iPad, I think, and make a backup that way. So there's a support document here, and if you look for Apple's documentation on that, they're actually pretty well up to date on it. Android varies a lot. Some of them have third-party apps that will specifically collect data safely from your phone into your computer. Some are more cloud-based, so that's something to look out for. And then in some cases, you might actually just be able to, so this is what it looks like in iTunes if you're using Mojave or earlier. And, you can kind of see what those backups look like in the future here. In Android, that varies a lot. In this case, you might be able to connect your Android phone to your computer and essentially drag and drop files. Sometimes that might not be readily available. Sometimes, you might have to do things like move things in and out of an SD card, for example. Other thing to think about, not all phones have the ability to encrypt SD cards that live on your Android phone. So if you're using your Android phone for shooting video, for shooting photos, you might want to look at where exactly that data exists, because if it's on a micro SD card that is not getting encrypted, that protection that full disk encryption gives you, unfortunately, might not apply to that SD card. Cool. Anyway, so I know that was kind of a bit of a rushed tour of a few different concerns to think about as independent journalists. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
We have one question here. Is having a device that can't be updated to the newest version of its operating system an inherent vulnerability then?
Yeah, it varies. With major versions of some operating systems, for example, I mentioned that I'm using Mojave. Mojave is not the latest Mac OS version, for example, but it's still getting security-related updates. And the same thing is true for like Windows 8, for example, and many older versions of Android, for example. Android 8, I think, is still getting security updates, even though it's not the latest version of Android per se. So if you can still run security updates for the version of Android or iOS that you're running, that still helps mitigate the same risks. So you're still good there. If you're using a phone though that is not able to have new security updates released to it, and this is kind of one of the caveats that comes into considerations when thinking about burner phones, for example, because I know that there is a lot of chatter about burner phones. Some of the advice is not necessarily as complete as I'd like it to see, and some of that mentions, hey, buy a cheap Android phone. Some of those cheap Android phones might not be able to let you have security updates sent to it that would be important to be able to have certain amount of protections available against certain police forensics tools. So yeah, in this case, I would recommend not necessarily getting the latest and greatest phone or latest point version of Android or iOS, but just making sure that your device can run security updates. Android has become better at this. If you look for a phone that has what is called the Android One certification, that basically has a contractual guarantee with the manufacturer that they signed with Google, saying that they will make security updates available to that phone. I think for 2 or 3 years, I don't remember the exact number, since that phone was launched. So that's another thing to think about if you're essentially looking for a second phone that you want to bring to an event. Thinking about when that phone's release date was versus how long it's going to, have security updates for. That begins at the point that it was released, not the point that you bought it.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions?
If anyone, post them in the chat, and we will read them.
We also have a pretty good guide on, and also on our website at freedom.press/training that I think is called like Your Smartphone and You, that just talks about kind of like the very, very fundamental first steps of like, hey, I know people tell me I shouldn't bring my phone to a protest, but if I am going to bring your phone to a protest, like what is the baseline of what is considered good security practices that are useful to have? And we talk about those there basically.
Great, we have that posted in the chat too. Yeah, I think we might have Gray here too, if anyone had questions for Gray as well.
Any other questions?
We have a question that they would love a personal password manager recommendation. Did you hear that?
Was that to someone specific? Sorry.
Not just anyone. If
This
you have a
is
recommendation
Cameron.
for a personal password manager.
Well, thanks everybody for their time. I can be reached down here.
No.
So if you can still see
David,
my
can
screen, David at freedom.press. If you have like any follow-up that you have, if you are an independent journalist, definitely hit us up. We're happy to help, advise in any way that we can. Not any way that we can, but in some ways. So definitely hit us up.
My internet might just be bad.
Can you hear me, David? Oh, David is having connectivity issues. Let's see. I was also thinking about what do you think it would look like if I just like toss you out some examples to think about for threat modeling, and we could like talk about them quickly. What do you think about if, say, we're going through this scenario of like working in an organization with someone who already has access, and then they somehow at some point during your working relationship become compromised or start acting in harmful ways towards the organization and the other people inside. Like, I feel like that's a pretty hard situation because there's maybe if you haven't taken steps beforehand to prevent that from happening, or thought about it beforehand, then it's going to be a difficult situation to sort of like try to get rid of access for people who already have it and lock stuff down. Any thoughts about that?
I guess I'll go. I guess from my perspective, first of all, that's a show that I would watch. It's espionage, it's spy games. It sounds very interesting. So at the very least, there's that. But no, I think it is a very complicated situation. Of course, yeah. They say awareness is the best form of self-defense, meaning that like, yeah, if you were kind of like prepared beforehand for betrayal, you could have prepared for it more. But of course, these things do happen. Maybe not in that specific scenario, but certainly within that specific scenario, having someone who is compromised and who has access to very personal or private information of a group, I think it would just be super scary. And it's hard to find a line between the group closing up completely and kind of becoming, let's say it was like a group of 10 people and one of the 10 is compromised, and then there's like an inner circle of like 3 people. They become the kind of like the acting group because of, there's a breaking of trust in the organization. But I would say even with that, there's a lot of like potential nuances there. It's like what type of information, in the tactical holistic security guide, they talk about organizing information by levels of confidentiality, like how much do you want it, like is this a public thing, is this a private thing? I think depending on the scenario, and of course depending on the status of the person who is compromised, having kind of like a tiered information system based on need to know. It's hard because a lot of these are like collective situations. So when we say need to know, it's like everyone should need to know, I guess, in some sense. But it is definitely a hard decision that needs to be made, and it's a decision where it's like lose an arm to save the rest of the body. You might lose out on some like information or data because of it, but it's still certainly worthwhile to try to address it. Is the best I can say without specific.
It's like thinking about the trade-off between locking things down to the point where it becomes hard for like information to flow while normal operations are just taking place and there's not any internal threat, and then like the trade-off of like not locking things down that hard is that then if there becomes an internal threat, that then it's like a lot more difficult to deal with. And I guess it also depends on like the sensitivity of the information that you're sort of handling and whether that can be just like public or not to start out with. And
yeah, it can be difficult, I think, without specifics, because even like we see that there's so many different like variances and situations depending on what's going on. But yeah, that's I like the way you put it. It's that fine balance, and again, pros or cons. There could be a lot of benefits to having a tight, closed group with not a lot of information coming in and out. But there's also cons to that, and vice versa. Having a completely open group where all information is shared with everyone without question is the other extreme. And it's kind of like, I think a lot of activist groups spend a lot of time trying to figure out, like, when I'm not working with close friends who I trust, I mean, even then, it's not always for sure, but when I'm not working with friends that I trust, when I'm working with random people to just like meet on the street, like, how do I keep my security in mind? How do I keep the security of maybe like my friends in mind with this nice-ish stranger who's helping me out at the moment, but could be doing something else a minute later? It's a very tough conversation. It's very complicated. I think, yeah, it just it breaks down a lot of things within group dynamics that I think people don't initially want to address when they start a project, but it's still very important to address.
I've been hearing a lot of people talking about like the challenges of intergroup trust also, where it's like, one group that has a built-up trust and another group that has a built-up trust within their internal organization, and then they're trying to work with each other and figure out systems to make that safe or like build trust there, relationships, and that's also like I don't know, something that people have been, that seems like relevant in this current moment when a lot of people are sort of like just starting to do that, or there seems to be more reasons for groups that are already established to start collaborating with each other, and needs to like share access to certain documents or have secure communications.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I don't know if David has any response to that he would like to add.
It's not really a question, really, just thoughts, you know.
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost the very beginning of that train of thought. Could you talk? Can you mention that again?
Oh, just having it feels like relevant recently to current situation seems like is presenting a lot of new opportunities for groups to collaborate with each other, um, and those groups maybe have built up their internal sort of trust and have some practices they feel safe about within their group, but maybe um, when they're trying to work with other groups, need like a different level of security to feel safe. And having those conversations across groups where there's not already a built up trust can be difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely, you know, something that is unique for each group, because each group will have their own particular histories, their own particular concerns, different adversaries that they might be aware of and some that they might not be aware of yet. So yeah, that discussion is hard. It's very it is a bit of a challenge. I know that like at FPF we have like a very mix of news journalists that work in newsrooms and kind of have like a very set way of doing things that was established by their IT department, but then there's like friction between their IT department and them. And so just even within an organization, there's already like some discord in terms of like what the protocol around secure communications should be. And in many ways, like having what we've acted as in many ways has been almost like a sort of like unofficial mediator, where we kind of like, well, we know about journalist concerns, we know about technology concerns, so these two groups aren't talking. How do we kind of like bridge the gap in some way? Say like, hey, so this is our concern with like using this firewall or whatever, and being like, hey, this is our concern with like using this corporate VPN, or hey, this is the kind of work that somebody would have to do that this actually blocks. Has helped kind of make it to add, a certain amount of, you bring in basically having somebody that can appreciate both groups and their concerns, and having them kind of be in the process actually, I think is useful. Or at least that's kind of been my experience in some way. And sorry, this is a little bit off tangent from what.
That seems like that's actually like a really useful, I think, approach and way of thinking about it.
Yeah, if I could just quickly add, and I think in addition to that, which I think is a super interesting take of like how different groups with different ethics, different security threats and models work with each other. I think the silver lining here is I think that what is seen a lot in the history of movements and why movements grow is in fact a diversity of tactics. So it's like these moments where two different groups interact are complicated, but so crucial and can be so very important to the health of whatever bigger thing happening. So I think they are important conversations to have. I think they're vital in some ways. Working out how it's going to get done is super complicated, for sure. And just as an example, I was reading one resource that we posted. It was from the the Hong Kong protests last year, and they were talking about how the 2014 Hong Kong protests versus the 2019, there was a lot of internal argument going on in 2014 around different styles. I mean, a lot of stuff you might see here between how to protest, what's the right way to protest, et cetera. In 2019, it seemed like there was more of like coalescing of like, you do your thing, we'll do our, but we have the same general value or same general goal. And people on the ground said that helped the kind of the virality of the movement, like stay alive, just people not getting in each other's way, like understanding boundaries, understanding needs, but then not really like getting into each other's business more than they have to.
Yeah, it seems like the diversity of tactics that we've been seeing in the current movements is like seems like it's been pretty effective also in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah, I think so too.
Does anyone else have any
Great.
sort of
So, yeah, any other questions?
There was somebody a while ago had asked on Instagram if Faraday cages are effective against stingrays as a specific question. I don't know if that's anything that you know about, but.
Yeah, if I can touch up on that a little bit. So Faraday cages, for anybody that's not familiar, usually are not actual cages, but in this case, pouches or bags or some other accessory that has essentially a metal mesh that blocks radio signals. So, like, this is an example of one that was created by my friend Adam Harvey. And this is, not a new technology. The, idea is that, like, well, we have airplane mode, we have all these other things, but because we don't really have too much visibility into, when it might, when something like, say, the emergency 911 system, or emergency call system, which does function even within airplane mode, etc., like when certain things could be used in such a way to essentially leak a cell phone connection. Even things like turning the phone off, there's some, unanswered questions on what can be done if a phone is off but still has a battery on and might have certain functionality turned on. And a lot of this, unfortunately comes down to guessing and thinking about, what might be possible. So one of the ways people have proposed of thinking about, mitigating all that risk kind of like all at once is basically being like, hey, even if, we can't trust our phones to be off or in airplane mode when we think they are, we can block the radio signals using physics, which, is a little bit harder to hack. So in this case, that's a really neat, kind of cool idea. I think, there's a lot of practical concerns there. When you make fabric with fine metal meshes, it wears really easily over time, and you don't get to say when that wears off to the point that it can leak radio signals. This actually happened to me with this pouch a long time ago, with an old Nokia phone that I had as a secondary phone. And, I was like, yeah, I got my Faraday cage. I'm full snowed in, can't track me. And my phone rings from inside the pouch. And oh, hey mom, how's it going? So it's, one of those things that on paper, it makes sense. There is actually a physics joke that you can make. You can make a joke about a cow if it's a perfect sphere. And that's a very weird physics, the way you do calculations based on what exists in paper versus what exists in the real world maps out very differently. And in this case, the reality of physical Faraday cages is that they wear off. You don't get to choose when they wear off and when they fail. So there's risks to think about there.
The other thing is that then you'll have to, if you want to be able to use your phone at all, you're still going to have to take it out of the Faraday cage and probably turn it on to be able to use it. So it maybe is not that effective if you want to have a phone with you that you can use at a protest. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think of a situation where maybe it would be useful. How much does a Faraday cage cost, or a Faraday pouch cost? Is it significantly cheaper than a burner setup, to the point that if somebody felt like they wanted to have a phone just in case they got into some really bad situation and it was worth it for them to be able to take out their normal phone in that situation, but otherwise wanted to make sure that it was off and away, then maybe it could be useful in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, if there is a situation where you have a second phone that doesn't have something that your primary phone has, and you really, really need to get to your primary phone for it, then that is one way you'd be able to mitigate the risk of, having that primary phone show up on the radar, so to speak. That being said, though, there's so many things that can go wrong with the way, burner phones are approached And I think, there's a kind of meta question here about, being able to look at what different risks are. In this case, like in many cases in independent journalism, we're not necessarily as concerned about location tracking as we are with the protection of our devices themselves and the confidentiality of our communications. And, a lot of these things are solvable problems within the device. Phone tracking, though, and location tracking is incredibly difficult to try to mitigate because there's so many things that can happen as you're creating this kind of second phone setup, whether it's, buying it with a credit card that is then traceable to real identity, going to like turning on the phone while it's, in your possession with your other phone. There's a lot of ways to mess it up. And at the end of the day, there are, protests with several tens of thousands of people, sometimes maybe not that many, but like a lot of people. And as far as, it's a very individual question as far as like whether somebody like a law enforcement agent tracking you is a particular risk or not. And that's something that we can't answer, broadly. It's something that is very personal to you. So yeah, unfortunately, like there are ways of doing burner phones really well that include, Faraday cages as a strategy to that. But ultimately, there's a million ways to make a mistake, and the Faraday cages, not working is one of the ways.
I don't think that we particularly have any more questions, and it seems like we're at our like scheduled end time. So unless you guys feel like you have anything else you want to say, I think now's our time to cut it.
So I want to say thank you to Babycastles for streaming this in the last workshop. Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you so much for coming and presenting.
Bye, everyone. Right? Yeah?
Take
Okay.
care.
Bye. Catch you later.
Later.
Bye.